Hello there, ladies, gentlemen, and all of you not-so-generic members of the populace. Now, I may not be contractually obligated to welcome you here to this podcast, but I think that we will anyway. So, greetings and welcome. It's very exciting to have you here for this first episode of His Majesty Speaks, the literature podcast for lovers of stories from books, films, or other forms of media, such as video games. Before we get started with today's topic, we'd like to take a portion of this time to explain what this podcast as a whole is going to be about. Now, there are absolute cavalcades of people who produce content concerning books and storytelling and other forms of media. However, we're going to be focusing on two areas in particular that still have a substantial amount of room to be explored. The first of these are the hidden gems. Stories that have, to some extent or another, been left by the wayside during the ever-increasing stream of entertainment media that releases on what's now a daily basis. When we have to pick and choose amongst so many similar works in the same genre, we can miss out on some truly meritable stories that get pushed aside by the more marketable ones. On several episodes, we will be highlighting some of these, attempting to draw out some of their more outstanding elements while discussing them alongside a larger narrative topic. The second category that we want to focus on is that of the classics. The reasons why this purposefully vague and broad category elicits my attention is something that I could go on for an entire episode for, but for the sake of this entry, I'll do my best to be brief. When discussing most stories that are especially old or popular, most academic or critical circles are pitiably prone to taking one of two stances that, where they given the room to breathe, don't hold up as especially critical or academic. Either they will treat the story as an untouchable masterpiece due to its technical or thematic accomplishments, or they will dismiss it out of hand due to its lack of what they might call cultural relevance or nuance. This can lead to certain tales receiving a rather obscene amount of reverence without any acknowledgement of their narrative shortcomings, or stories that once captivated a global audience, usually for a reason, believe it or not, being put aside just because they somehow conflict with current higher academic ideals. On episodes concerning these types of stories, we will be balancing the academic view with a more reader-centric one, and talking about parts from each that will help you decide for yourself whether you find one tale or another worth picking up. In the briefest sense, this podcast is for anyone with an interest in picking up a few of those sweet, sweet knowledge nuggets about stories from old to new while you go about your day. So, for our first episode, in celebration of the remastered edition that just released a few weeks ago, we will be focusing on a hidden gem, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles and its interesting use of setting-based storytelling. Now, outside of the game community, video games aren't always acknowledged as one of the primary mediums of storytelling, but many developers have increasingly leaned into games' potential to tell a compelling narrative while taking advantage of their unique opportunities to establish a personal connection with their audience. Final Fantasy, a series whose name has taken on a good deal of irony with 15 core installments and dozens of other spin-off games, has helped spearhead video game storytelling since the first game's release in 1987. Most of the mainline games have focused on telling sweeping fantasy stories with memorable characters and plots for players to engage with, earning them a large amount of praise worldwide. However, Crystal Chronicles is a spin-off game that was developed with different aims. Released on the Nintendo GameCube in 2003, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles was meant to provide a unique multiplayer experience by incorporating the Game Boy link cable. While this allowed for various new features, it meant that the overhead cost just to enjoy the multiplayer was very high, requiring at least 2 Game Boy Advance consoles, 2 link cables, and a copy of the game, naturally. This didn't make as much of an impact in the developer's home country of Japan, where the aforementioned consoles and accessories were better marketed and more widespread. But most potential players in the West were unable to experience the multiplayer mode, the primary draw of the game. Many of those who got to appreciate the multiplayer loved the game, making several fond memories with their friends and forming a small but solid fanbase. In contrast, The majority, who only played the single-player mode, harbored a lot of criticism for the game, viewing it as hollow and simplistic. Most of this criticism was centered on inconvenient aspects of the gameplay, leaving the title's simple story as a footnote as it was corralled off into obscurity. However, Crystal Chronicles' story harbors some of its finest merits, ones that may very well outshine some of the most praised titles in its genre. But before diving into the content of the game itself, I need to highlight something important. There are 3 basic components to narrative that your average education will beat into your brain until it falls out the back of your skull: characters, plot, and setting. The first 2 components are generally touted as the backbone of a good story. Compelling, relatable, or outlandish, memorable characters struggling their way through an engaging plot has been the cornerstone for enthralling audiences since the days of ancient Greek theater. Usually a narrative will be referred to as character-based or plot-based, depending on whether more time is spent fleshing out character personalities, motivations, and relationships, or cultivating a plot that thoroughly grasps the audience's imagination and keeps them personally invested in the story's events from start to finish. Setting, the place and time of a story, is meant to serve as the backdrop to these things. So, when I ask people about setting-based storytelling, they generally assume that I'm referring to stories whose settings clearly establish character motivations, the historical background and exciting incidents for the plot, or the laws that govern the narrative's physical and societal worlds. But, for what I'm actually getting at, those simply won't do. Setting should accomplish all of those things. They're simply what make a good setting. Having characters or plots that break consistency with their setting is a pitfall that lies at the center of many of the large cinematic productions that have been thrown our way in the past few years. A narrative without consistency is using a balloon as its foundation. It's bright, large, shiny, but if you so much as poke it with a needle, the whole thing blows up. So, no. When I refer to a setting-based storytelling, I'm talking about something that reaches a bit deeper. Just as a character-based story reveals many of its other details through character interactions, a setting-based story expresses its narrative primarily through its setting, rather than using it to prop up the other 2 components. This is something very difficult, and correspondingly rare, as a setting can't engage in direct dialogue, and it is inherently static. It doesn't change unless influenced in some other way by plot or the characters. Additionally, it's a very unfriendly medium to literature, which lacks a visual component to provide large amounts of information about the setting without spending an inefficient amount of time describing it. Written narratives that focus too hard on describing their setting either sacrifice establishing certain aspects of their characters or plot, or risk losing engagement with their audience by disrupting the flow of the story. This is part of why you'll hear me use the word story a lot in place of a book when I talk about literature in general, despite books being my primary focus. Books, films, games, and even art are all legitimate mediums for spinning a narrative, telling a story, and the best stories usually arise when they lean into the advantages inherent to their medium. Books have nearly boundless freedom with providing multiple perspectives, insights into characters, or clear information that might not be evident in another medium if it isn't directly exposited by a character. Movies can provide an immersive visual experience in addition to one that relies on language, hence why the phrase often used to encourage potential filmmakers to take advantage of their medium is show, don't tell. Video games have interactive components with potential that reaches in different directions contingent on their genre. In the case of Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, its use of central characters that act as a proxy for the players, creative visual design, and the explorative journey that drives its gameplay serve to lay a great foundation for setting-based storytelling. Buckle up, though. It's time for a bit of an exposition dump that I'll try to keep as perfectly pleasant and short as plausibly possible. Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles takes place in a fantasy world that has been blanketed in a poisonous fog, referred to as miasma, for hundreds of years. The miasma, presumably magic in origin, can only be warded off by massive crystals. These crystals have become the center of towns and cities, acting as a safeguard to the world's remaining civilizations. However, the crystals aren't an endless source of protection. They are powered by a rare substance that needs to be harvested every year. Otherwise, the light of the crystal will fade, and the town will die out. Every year, each town and city sends out a crystal caravan, a group who use a small shard of the crystal to safely travel the world and gather the resources needed to keep their town safe for another year. In line with one of the drawbacks of video games as a medium, the substance that the crystals need comes from so-called myrrh trees that can only be found at the center of highly dangerous dungeons like abandoned mines or old towns whose crystals died. You, as the players, create characters to act as members of the Crystal Caravan for the starting town, which you are also free to name. It isn't rare for video games to use characters as stand-ins for the players. It helps to create a personal connection, make one feel like an agent in the narrative rather than a mere spectator. It's a device most famously used by series like The Legend of Zelda and Pokemon, which double down on the idea by making the protagonist silent and allowing players to imprint their own personality on the character and see the character's journey as their own. That being said, turning the protagonist of a story into a blank slate has several potential drawbacks that can outweigh the benefits. A stand-in character is hollow by design, and, as a result, that character's journey can feel hollow if the story doesn't succeed at instilling the player with that sense of personal attachment. If other characters' interactions with the player stand-in don't stem directly from actions that the player takes, it makes it seem as though the game is trying to tell two different stories that simply don't match. Even worse, if a character who is meant to undergo some kind of development is hollowed out to be a player stand-in or avatar, that character is robbed of their agency and seems out of place because of it. One of many reasons that most narratives focus on a single main character or ensemble cast is to help ground the story in the reality of human experience, where there's constant action and reaction between people and their environment. Forgoing this element of character building is a handicap that cripples as many games as it helps. The way that Crystal Chronicles leans into this mechanic is that almost all of the story elements of interest are embedded in the setting rather than characters or plot events. As you travel the world in your caravan, you encounter caravans from other towns, but their interactions only provide you with more information about the towns that they come from and smaller aspects of the world. The rest of what you learn about the world of Crystal Chronicles is embedded in the dungeons that the players explore. This, for better or worse, entirely makes the player's adventure the character's adventure. I will point out that this can turn out to be just as much of a weakness as a strength, depending on the player's experience. Many of the game's detractors cite the story as non-existent due to their inability to engage with it, and I can't say that I always blame them. Because of the rewards of a setting-based story are entirely derivative of the audience's engagement with the setting. In contrast with books or film, content in video games runs a much higher risk of being missed, and Crystal Chronicles does have holes in its design that can allow for that. But my experience with the game highlighted the potential brilliance in those risks, as, if they weren't taken, the game would lack the unique aspects that it does have to offer. Each dungeon in the game begins with a short narration that talks about the place you are entering, but it is never made clear who is speaking other than that they are, or were, a part of a crystal caravan. This, compounded with the whimsical tone of the narrator, grants an almost mythical atmosphere to the location as the camera pans over it. For example, the second available dungeon opens to a large forest with giant mushrooms that dwarf the strange creatures that inhabit it, and the narrator cites this tale. When I was a child, I once asked my mother, "Where did I come from?" She replied, "Why, we all sprouted in the mushroom forest, of course." Nightmares soon haunted my sleep. I dreamt I was lost amongst the toadstools. I awoke in tears, but felt the warmth of my mother's embrace as she comforted me. It is something I still remember to this day. This sets up an interesting contrast between the narration, which, were it taken out of context, would imply that the mushroom forest is only a myth, and the visuals, which establish the forest as a very real and dangerous place. Correspondingly, that can set the players wondering about the mother's answer. Did people, or at least some of the life in this world, spring from the forest? While there is no dialogue or character interactions to speculate on it, the question provides an inquisitive frame for the player to explore the dungeon. When I first played through the game with my cousin, we enjoyed tackling our way through the dungeons together, solving puzzles while fighting off monsters and looking for new items. But we also spent a lot of time speculating on where the game was going, if any dungeon was of particular importance, and how the game would end, even if it had an ending at all. The fact that we weren't accompanied by characters who explained every aspect of the plot left us with the responsibility of discovering it on our own. And that adventure was just as much of an experience as playing through the game itself. We were trying to unravel a mystery, turning up one piece at a time. I won't try to pawn the game off as a masterpiece, a dangerously presumptuous term to say the least, as I understand this type of experience isn't for everyone. There is a lot to be enjoyed in a linear narrative that carefully constructs each of its story beats so that the audience can take the whole thing in. After all, funnily enough, it was the explorative aspect of the game that my cousin and I enjoyed so much that led us astray and kept us from actually completing the original release. I mentioned before that the game plays through in cycles of years. The caravan sets out to 3 dungeons of the player's limited choosing each year to acquire the myrrh needed to protect their village. Once the 3rd dungeon is completed, the caravan returns to its hometown before setting off on a new adventure the following year. Each myrrh tree can only produce 1 drop of myrrh every few years, so the players are slowly forced to travel farther and farther out into the world each year, discovering new dungeons and towns across the world. Along the way, you meet other caravans who provide some smaller details about the world and themselves. That is, with a couple exceptions. Starting with the very first year of the caravan's journey, travelers that they encounter make references to an unparalleled warrior called the Black Knight. At first, he is revered by those you meet, but his journey, which plays out in the background of the player's own, slowly takes a downward turn. As the years go on, the Black Knight vanishes for a time before returning as a dangerous madman. The player's caravan even runs into another caravan that he attacked, and their next encounter regarding him is an investigation into his initial disappearance. The caravan that the characters encounter informs them that the Black Knight was supposedly hired as a bodyguard by a preacher named Hurdy. Interestingly enough, if the caravan encounters Hurdy during any of his appearances in the various towns that they can visit, he usually talks about wishing to rid the world of miasma. The 2 of them were seen setting up camp deep in the swamplands before mysteriously vanishing. Hurdy reappears later on, but he claims to have no memories of the Black Knight or their journey together. When the Black Knight is finally thrust into the foreground of the player's story several years later, he is chasing a ball of light that nobody else can see, claiming that it stole his memories. He lashes out like a berserker before running off. Shortly afterward, he inadvertently attacks another caravan while chasing this invisible foe. Unable to see who he is really facing, he is slain by one of the members of that caravan. For my cousin and I, who took a deep interest in the Black Knight from the first time that he was mentioned, and were captivated by his unique design when he finally appeared, this seemed to be a huge waste. However, this was the point where the game made its first intervention in directing the player towards its conclusion. As the Black Knight dies, he regains some of his memories and offers some mysterious words. "I'm sorry. I didn't want it to end this way. As long as people live, Rayam will make them suffer. O Keepers of the Crystal, what must I do?" This can generally clue the players in that Ram, the force presumably behind that mysterious light, is going to be one of the game's final enemies, and likely has some connection to the miasma. However, the rest of the pieces in that puzzle come through a muddier source. Another recurring character that the caravan meets in their travels is Gertie, a bard who claims to be Hurdy's twin brother. Gertie is a clumsy, goofy character who is constantly getting himself in trouble with other caravans. My cousin and I found him to be the only thing in the game that was not only bad, but insufferable. His design was goofy and encounters uncompelling. Each time the caravan ran into him, they would bail him out of one problem or another, and all he would offer in return was a seemingly nonsensical poem. The only thing that we found interesting was his final encounter. The last time that the caravan runs into Gertie on the road, he is dressed like his brother, Hurdy, and it is actually implied that they may very well be the same person. He talks about Hurdy's desire to rid the world of miasma, but then, as he walks away, the scene cuts away to show Hurdy, the Black Knight, and the mysterious light that attacked the latter before offering the following prompt. You cannot defeat Ram. You are not ready. Your memories are not enough. Depending on the player's progress up to that point, that can seem even more vague and confusing than the Black Knight's dying words. But my cousin and I soon had a theory to match it when we discovered one of the final areas in the game. Far in the north of the main continent are the Ravenna Plains, a region that houses 3 prominent points of interest, including 2 of the game's best dungeons. The first of these, Conal Currach, caught our attention immediately, as it was a massive swamp, likely the one that Hurdy and the Black Knight were seen in before their disappearance. The dungeon immediately sets a darker, more serious tone as the camera pans over the desolate wetlands and the narrator cites, "This marsh has thwarted travelers since ancient times. The rain that falls here is thick with miasma, much to the chagrin of prospective intruders. In days of old, the Selkies, one of the 4 tribes of people that populate the world of Crystal Chronicles, were driven from their ancestral home. They marched ever westward in search of a new haven. They built bridges over the swamp. Then, at long last, they reached the other side. But once there, they found no land to call home." The dungeon features several new enemy types, including the first encounterable ghosts, which require special spells to defeat. Dungeon difficulty steadily increases through each year in the game, but the discovery of this area marks one of its only massive leaps, seeming to further signal its importance. The undead dragon at the end of the dungeon remains one of the most challenging bosses throughout the game. It quickly became one of our favorites and remains one of my most memorable video game locations. However, it paled in comparison to what followed. Long ago, the 4 tribes once lived together in a glorious age of prosperity. But such days have long since faded from memory. There was no miasma, nor any monsters. The world was pleasant, until darkness came and choked the northern skies. They say that the golden age is gone, never to return, but I believe that somehow we can bring it back. I must believe, if I am to carry on. These are the words of the narrator as the player caravan enters Ravenna Te Ra, a massive temple that lies at the end of the plains. As the player caravan enters, when the northern sky is clear, one of the game's most ambitious pieces of music opens with a choral background and an escalating ensemble of instruments that help construct an air of chilling significance. Ravenna Te Ra takes everything that Conal Currach did and magnifies it. The dungeon is filled with powerful skeletons and wraiths, and the lich that awaits the players at the end challenges players far more than any encounter thus far. When first discovering it, my cousin and I felt sure that the temple must be one of the game's final dungeons and hold some other secret, but there was one more point of interest that lay directly past it. The regions of Crystal Chronicles are segregated by massive streams of miasma. Each stream is connected to one of the 4 elements: wind, fire, earth, or water, and they are impassable unless the caravan's crystal is imbued with the corresponding element. This mechanic is used to guide the player along a specific path during the first few years of their journey, forcing them to enter specific dungeons and acquire the appropriate element. However, there is another miasma stream in Ravenna Plains that has a mystery element, and is impossible to pass with any of them that are conventionally available to the players. My cousin and I came up with so many theories on how to get past it. We tried searching Ravenna Ra for the hidden element, tried seeing if a way to obtain the element would appear after the 20th or 30th year. Recalling the prompt from the final encounter with Gertie, we even wondered if it would become possible to pass through the stream if the players accumulated 100 memories. All great, interesting ideas that were completely wrong, and neither of us figured out the correct way. It wasn't until nearly a decade later that I learned the real way to pass through the miasma stream and enter the game's final region, and it was no wonder that we never figured it out, as the final piece of the puzzle was Gertie. Annoying, pathetic, wheedling Gertie and his nonsensical poems. As it turned out, each of Gertie's poems were clues to how the players could find the hidden element in a desert dungeon completely on the other side of the world from Ravenna Plains. They made little sense on their own, and even together they were vague, requiring the players to actively search for the place that each of them applied. Naturally, this was mostly our fault for actively dismissing a character that the narrative repeatedly threw in our faces, but from what I've found, we were far from the only people to encounter this problem, and many players were only able to complete the game with the assistance of a guide. So, the problem speaks competently for itself. As much as we loved the story for the agency it granted us as players, its lack of clear focus also led many of us astray and failed to guide us through the entire intended experience. It is for this reason that I chose Crystal Chronicles to highlight both the strengths and weaknesses of setting-based storytelling. As a device, it provides many extra opportunities to reward an attentive audience. However, it relinquishes many of the tools that can keep a narrative streamlined and focused, which is part of why it's rarely used as the driving force in most narratives. Additionally, the more development placed into a setting, the more consistency that it requires. A character that is inconsistent or problematic is easier to overlook if they are counterbalanced by the rest of the cast. A plot with some weaker points can avoid spoiling the rest if they are compelling enough. But holes in a setting act as a foundation of a narrative can cause it to crumble completely. For a brief example, as I simply can't resist, there is a certain post-apocalyptic YA novel of some repute that will likely have its own episode due to my love of hating it so dearly. The story focuses on a country that divides all of its individual asset production into sectors. A sector for mining, textiles, you name it. Yet, when the sector in charge of agriculture collapses in rebellion, there are hardly any tangible consequences for other factions. And, well, if a narrative believes that it can let that slide without justification, it can get away with just about anything, and every aspect of the story suffers. In contrast, captivating settings such as Tolkien's famed Middle-earth can outshine the characters that populate them. So, I encourage you, whether as a reader or an audience of any kind, keep a close eye on the environment of the stories you consume. If it is well done, there may be some finer details that embellish your experience, or, if they are less developed, it may help you view the story with a more critical and comprehensive eye. And with that, we have reached the end of this first episode of His Majesty Speaks. If you made it this far, thank you for tagging along on this little journey. It's been great to get a chance to talk about one of the games that, despite its flaws, kindled my early passion for storytelling. And, if it's your kind of thing, you might want to give the remastered version of Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles a try for yourself. If you liked this podcast and are interested in tuning in to future discussions on storytelling across the board, please recommend us to one of your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, well, go ahead and sail it off to some ruffian who's gotten on your nerves lately. Either way, I'm hoping to get the next installment out within the next month or so, and work my way up to releasing an episode every 2 weeks. In the meantime, please like, subscribe, and do all those other obligatory YouTube algorithm things if you would like to know about future podcasts. Also, feel free to leave a comment about what you thought or a story that you think would make a suitable centerpiece for a future entry. So, I release you! Return to your daily dalliances, and we will see you next time.